can't go through there. That's for authorized personnel only.
I am authorized personnel. I work here.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Turn around and use the public entrance like everyone else.
I'm a judge. I've used this entrance for 6 years. Now please step aside.
Right, and I'm the governor and I'm telling you to leave.
Tuesday morning, November 7th, 2023. The Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia. Officer Jason Miller had exactly 90 seconds before he committed career suicide. The woman standing in front of him wasn't a confused visitor. She wasn't lost. She was Judge Tanya Williams, a sitting Superior Court judge with a full docket starting in less than 15 minutes. She'd parked in the judge's lot, used her key card to access the secured hallway, and was walking toward her chambers when Jason decided she looked like someone who didn't belong. What Jason didn't know was that Judge Williams had a photographic memory for faces and voices, that she'd presided over hundreds of cases involving officer misconduct, and that his next words would be played in a disciplinary hearing that would cost him everything. Before we continue, where are you watching from right now? Drop your state or country below. And if stories about accountability are your thing, hit that subscribe button because this one is absolutely wild. Judge Tanya Williams was 39 years old and had been on the bench for 6 years. Before that, she'd spent 8 years as a prosecutor, putting away some of the most dangerous criminals in Georgia. She tried over 100 cases and won 87% of them. She was tough, brilliant, and absolutely no one who knew her would ever describe her as someone who got pushed around. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Tanya, as friends called her, woke up at 5:30 a.m., went for a 3-mile run, showered, and put on one of her work suits, a charcoal gray Armani that had cost more than some people's monthly rent. She was hearing motions all morning and had a sentencing hearing in the afternoon. She'd reviewed all the case files over the weekend. She was prepared. She arrived at the courthouse at 7:45 a.m. The building officially opened to the public at 8 o'clock, but judges, court staff, and security personnel could access the building earlier through secured entrances. Tonya had done this hundreds of times. She parked in the judge's only parking area behind the building, used her key card on the rear entrance, and walked down the secured hallway toward the judicial chambers. That's when Jason Miller stepped out from the security office and blocked her path. Jason was 29 years old and had been a courthouse security officer for 11 months. He wasn't a police officer in the traditional sense. He was employed by a private security company contracted by the county. He wore a uniform that looked similar to a police uniform, carried a gun, and had arrest authority within the courthouse building. But he had nowhere near the training of an actual sworn officer. Jason had been assigned to the night shift for most of his tenure, which meant he rarely interacted with judges or attorneys. He'd been moved to day shift just 2 weeks earlier. He was still learning the routines, the faces, the flow of people through the building. When he saw Tanya walking down the secured hallway, his brain made an instant calculation. Young, female, black, not wearing a uniform, must be lost or trying to sneak in early. He stepped directly into her path. "Hey, you can't go through there. That's for authorized personnel only." Tanya stopped. She'd been mentally reviewing her morning docket and hadn't noticed him approach. She looked up, registered his uniform, and understood immediately what was happening. She'd seen it before, not to her usually, but to other people who didn't look like what security guards expected. "I am authorized personnel," she said calmly. "I work here." Jason looked her up and down. The expensive suit didn't register. The key card clipped to her belt didn't register. The leather briefcase with the Georgia state seal didn't register. All he saw was someone who, in his mind, didn't belong. "Yeah, I'm sure you do," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Turn around and use the public entrance like everyone else." Tanya felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had 1,000 times in her life. Being followed in stores, being asked if she was in the right place, being assumed to be the secretary, the paralegal, the cleaning staff, anything except what she actually was. "I'm a judge," she said, keeping her voice level. "I've used this entrance for 6 years. Now please step aside." Jason actually laughed. "Right, and I'm the governor and I'm telling you to leave." This is the moment where most people would have just complied, would have turned around and left, would have walked away to avoid the confrontation. But Tanya wasn't most people. She'd spent her entire career fighting for justice, and justice didn't mean complying with people who abused what little authority they had. "I don't have to follow your orders," Tanya said. "I've accessed this hallway with my authorized key card. I'm walking to my chambers, and you have no legal basis to detain me." Jason's expression hardened. He was used to compliance. When he told people to do something, they did it. This woman was challenging him, and he didn't like it. "You're in a restricted area without visible authorization," he said, trying to sound official. "I can detain anyone who poses a security risk." "A security risk?" Tanya's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. I'm a 40-year-old woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase. What exactly about me suggests I'm a security risk? You're refusing to comply with security protocols. No, you're making up protocols because you've decided I don't belong here. There's a difference. A door opened down the hallway. Another judge, an older white man named Judge Turner, walked out of his chambers. He saw Tonya and Jason and immediately understood the situation. "Good morning, Judge Williams," he called out loudly. "Everything all right?" Jason's head snapped toward Judge Turner, then back to Tonya. His face went pale. "Judge," he said quietly. "Yes, Judge. As I told you." Tonya looked at Judge Turner. "Good morning, David. I'm fine. Just an apparently confused security officer who decided I looked like I didn't belong in the judicial hallway." Judge Turner walked over. He was 62, had been on the bench for 20 years, and had zero patience for this kind of nonsense. "Jason, isn't it? We met last week during the security briefing." Jason nodded, unable to speak. "Judge Williams has chambers 3 doors down from mine. She's been here for 6 years. She's one of the most respected jurists in this courthouse. And you just detained her?" I didn't know. She didn't." Jason was stumbling over his words. "She didn't what? She didn't look like what you think a judge should look like? Have you ever been told you don't look like you belong in your own workplace? Type yes in the comments." Tonya held up her hand. "David, it's fine. I'll handle this." She turned to Jason. "You stopped me because I'm black, and you assumed I couldn't possibly be a judge. You ordered me to leave even though I'd accessed a secured area with an authorized keycard. You used your authority to intimidate me into compliance. And you did all of this while calling me a liar." "Judge Williams, I'm so sorry I didn't." "You didn't think," Tonya interrupted. "You made an assumption based on what I look like, and then you doubled down when I told you the truth. That's not a training issue, that's a bias issue." "I'll report this to my supervisor immediately," Judge Turner said. "No need," Tonya replied. "I'll handle it myself. I have court in 10 minutes. She looked at Jason. "Step aside." Jason moved. Tonya walked past him toward her chambers, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Judge Turner followed her with his eyes, then looked at Jason with an expression that clearly said, "You just ended your career." Tonya unlocked her chambers and went inside. Her law clerk, a young woman named Naomi, was already there preparing files. "Morning, Judge. You okay? You look upset." Tonya set her briefcase down. "I'm fine. Just had an interesting encounter with the new security officer." She sat at her desk and pulled out her phone. She opened her email and began typing. The email was addressed to the chief judge, the court administrator, and the security company's regional manager. The subject line read, "Formal complaint, security officer racial profiling." The email was detailed, professional, and damning. It described exactly what had happened, the words that were used, Jason's refusal to accept her identification of herself, and his demand that she leave the secured area after she'd already accessed it with proper credentials. She noted that the entire interaction occurred in a hallway covered by security cameras and requested that footage be preserved immediately. She sent the email at 7:58 a.m. By 8:05 a.m., her phone was ringing. The chief judge wanted to see her immediately. Tonya walked down to the chief judge's chambers. Chief Judge Leonard Price was 68 years old, had been on the bench for 30 years, and was not happy. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Tonya told him. "Every detail, every word." Chief Judge Price's jaw got tighter as the story went on. When Tonya finished, he was silent for a long moment. "I'm going to pull the security footage right now," he said. "This is completely unacceptable. I'm not asking for special treatment," Tonya said. "I'm asking that the same standards that would apply to anyone else apply here. If he profiled me, if he abused his authority, there should be consequences." "There will be," Chief Judge Price said grimly. By 9:00 a.m., the security footage had been pulled and reviewed. It showed exactly what Tonya had described. Jason blocking her path, the conversation, his dismissive body language, his refusal to let her pass even after she identified herself. The security company's regional manager, a woman named Janet Holloway, arrived at the courthouse by 10:00 a.m. She watched the footage 3 times. "This is indefensible," she said quietly. Jason was called into an emergency meeting. Present were Janet Holloway, Chief Judge Price, the court administrator, and a representative from the county's legal department. They played the security footage for him. "Can you explain your actions?" Janet asked. Jason tried. He said he didn't recognize Judge Williams. He said he was following security protocols. He said he was just trying to do his job. "Security protocols don't include racial profiling," Janet said. "You stopped a woman who had legitimate access to a secured area. You ordered her to leave after she told you she was a judge. You refused to believe her. And you did all of this to someone who uses that hallway every single day. I didn't mean your intent doesn't matter, your actions do. And your actions violated our company's policies on non-discriminatory conduct and appropriate use of authority. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. At the end, Jason was suspended pending a full investigation. The investigation took 2 weeks. During that time, investigators pulled footage from every day Jason had worked at the courthouse. They were looking for patterns. They found them. Jason had stopped 4 other women of color who worked in the courthouse over his 11 months of employment. A Latina court reporter who he'd questioned about why she was in the building before public hours. A black prosecutor who he'd followed to make sure she was really going where she said she was going. An Asian interpreter who he'd asked to produce 2 forms of identification even though she was wearing her courthouse credentials. None of these women had filed formal complaints. They'd all assumed it was just an overzealous security guard. They'd all shown their identifications, proven who they were, and moved on. But when investigators interviewed them as part of the investigation into Tanya's complaint, they all told similar stories. Jason had treated them with suspicion. He'd questioned their right to be in the building. He demanded extra proof of identity. The court reporter, Marisol Vega, told investigators that Jason had stopped her 5 separate times over 3 months. Each time, she was carrying her court reporter equipment bag and wearing her courthouse identification badge. Each time, Jason acted as if he'd never seen her before and questioned whether she was authorized to be there. It got to the point where I started arriving later when the public entrance was open just to avoid him, Marisol told investigators. I have early cases sometimes and I'm supposed to use the secured entrance, but dealing with him every time wasn't worth it. I felt like I had to prove I belonged there every single day. The prosecutor, a woman named Tanya Mitchell, described an incident where Jason had followed her from the parking lot all the way to the district attorney's offices. He didn't say anything at first, just walked about 10 feet behind me the whole way. When I finally turned around and asked if he needed something, he said he was making sure I knew where I was going. I've been a prosecutor here for 8 years. I know where I'm going. The interpreter, Grace Liu, had been stopped by Jason in the main lobby while she was wearing her courthouse interpreter badge visibly on her jacket. He asked for my identification. I pointed to my badge. He said he needed to see a driver's license or state identification as well. I asked why, since I was clearly credentialed. He said it was new protocol. I showed him my license. Later, I watched him interact with a white male attorney in the same lobby. That attorney wasn't wearing any visible identification at all, and Jason just waved and said good morning. No demands for identification, nothing. Meanwhile, footage showed Jason interacting with white male attorneys, white female staff members, and white judges. In those interactions, he was polite, deferential, and never demanded identification even when people accessed secured areas. Investigators found at least a dozen instances where white attorneys or staff members entered the secured judicial hallway without Jason even acknowledging them, let alone demanding identification. Some of these people weren't wearing visible credentials. Some were clearly visiting attorneys who didn't work in the courthouse regularly. But Jason never stopped them, never questioned them, never demanded proof of who they were. One particularly revealing piece of footage showed Jason holding the door open for an older white man in casual clothes, jeans, and a polo shirt who entered through the secured entrance. The man wasn't wearing any identification. Jason never asked who he was or why he was there. The man turned out to be a retired judge who was visiting a friend. He had no current authorization to use the secured entrance, but Jason let him through without a word. 2 days later, that same Jason stopped Tanya Mitchell, who was wearing a prosecutor's badge and carrying case files clearly marked District Attorney's Office, and demanded to see additional identification. The pattern was undeniable. Jason made assumptions based on race and gender. He saw women of color as inherently suspicious, and he used his authority to challenge their presence in ways he never did with white employees. The investigation also revealed something troubling about Jason's background. Before being hired by the security company, he'd worked at 2 other security positions. At one, he'd been fired after 3 months for conduct incompatible with company values. At the other, he'd resigned before facing a disciplinary hearing related to complaints about his treatment of customers. The security company had conducted a background check, but it was cursory. They'd verified his guard license and checked for criminal history, but they hadn't contacted his previous employers for detailed references. If they had, they would have learned that Jason had a pattern of targeting people of color in his security interactions. This revelation made the company's liability even clearer. They'd failed to properly vet an employee who then went on to discriminate against multiple courthouse employees. The investigation report was 23 pages long. It concluded that Jason had engaged in racial profiling, violated company policies, and created a hostile work environment for minority courthouse employees. It recommended immediate termination. But the report went further. It also identified systemic failures in the company's hiring and training practices. It noted that guards received minimal training on implicit bias, that there was no system for tracking complaints about individual guards, and that there was no oversight of how guards interacted with courthouse employees versus the general public. The report made recommendations: enhanced background checks, including detailed reference calls, mandatory implicit bias training before guards began working, regular refresher training every 6 months, a formal complaint system where courthouse employees could report concerns anonymously, and quarterly audits of guard interactions to identify potential patterns of discrimination. Jason was fired 3 weeks after the incident with Judge Williams. The termination letter cited violations of company policy regarding non-discriminatory conduct, failure to treat all individuals with respect regardless of race or ethnicity, and actions that damaged the company's relationship with a major client. Jason appealed the termination through the company's internal grievance process. His appeal argued that he'd been following his understanding of security protocols, that he hadn't intended any discrimination, and that termination was too harsh a penalty for what he claimed was a misunderstanding. The grievance committee reviewed all the evidence: the security footage from Tanya's encounter, the footage showing his pattern with other women of color, the footage showing his different treatment of white employees, the testimony from the 4 other women he'd stopped, and his employment history showing previous issues at other jobs. The appeal was denied. The committee's decision noted that while intent matters, impact matters more. Jason's actions, regardless of his claimed intent, had created a discriminatory environment. His pattern of behavior showed bias, not just poor judgment, and his history suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, but a consistent pattern. Jason was 29 years old, and his security career was over before it really started. But the story didn't end there. The security company issued a formal apology to Judge Williams and the other women Jason had profiled. The apology was public and specific, acknowledging that Jason had engaged in racial profiling and that the company had failed in its duty to properly train and supervise him. They implemented mandatory bias training for all courthouse security personnel. The training wasn't a quick online video, but a full-day intensive workshop that included scenarios, role-playing, and discussions about implicit bias and its impacts. Every guard had to complete it within 60 days or be terminated. They created a new policy requiring security officers to complete cultural competency training every 6 months. This training included education about the diverse workforce in courthouses, the importance of treating all people with equal respect regardless of appearance, and the legal and ethical obligations of security personnel. They established a direct complaint line for courthouse employees who experienced discriminatory treatment. The line went straight to the regional manager, bypassing local supervisors who might be inclined to protect their staff rather than address legitimate complaints. And they agreed to provide quarterly reports to the courthouse administration detailing any complaints received and any disciplinary actions taken. The Fulton County government also took action. They reviewed their contract with the security company and added provisions requiring detailed background checks, including review of any prior complaints about discriminatory conduct. They required quarterly reports on security interactions, broken down by race and gender, to identify patterns. And they gave courthouse employees a formal process to report security concerns directly to the court administrator. The county also implemented its own training program for all courthouse staff, judges included, on recognizing and addressing bias in the workplace. If security guards needed training, the reasoning went, everyone needed training. Judge Williams used the incident as a teaching moment. In a speech at a legal conference 3 months later, she talked about implicit bias and how it shows up in everyday interactions. "I wasn't in danger," she said. "I wasn't going to lose my job or face criminal charges, but I was treated as if I didn't belong in my own workplace. And if it can happen to a judge in a courthouse, imagine what happens to regular people every single day. Imagine being stopped while grocery shopping, while walking in your neighborhood, while sitting in your car. And imagine not having the authority or credentials to push back." She continued, "The courthouse should be a place where justice is not only delivered, but modeled. Every person who works there, from the judges to the clerks to the cleaning staff, should be treated with equal respect. When a security guard profiles people based on their race, when he demands extra proof of belonging from some people but not others, he's not keeping anyone safe. He's perpetuating the very injustice we're supposed to be fighting against. Do you think Jason deserved to be fired? Type "fired" in the comments. The speech went viral. It was shared thousands of times on social media. Other women, especially women of color in professional positions, shared their own stories in response. The public defender who was assumed to be a defendant, the doctor who was assumed to be a nurse, the lawyer who was assumed to be a secretary, the chief executive officer who was asked if she was there to clean the office. The stories poured in, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Each one a small moment of being told, implicitly or explicitly, that you don't look like you belong. A black female pilot shared her story of being stopped multiple times in the crew-only areas of airports, with security assuming she couldn't possibly be a pilot. An Indian American engineer described being questioned at her own company's security desk, with guards assuming she was there for a job interview, not as a senior director. A Native American attorney described being told she was in the wrong building when trying to enter a prestigious law firm where she was a named partner. A Middle Eastern surgeon talked about patients asking to see the real doctor after she'd introduced herself. The thread of stories seemed endless, and they all had the same theme: people making assumptions based on appearance, and those assumptions always working against people of color. Judge Williams' speech sparked a broader conversation. Law schools started incorporating discussions of implicit bias into their professional responsibility courses. Bar associations began offering continuing legal education credits for training on recognizing and addressing bias in legal settings. Courthouse administrators across the country reviewed their security protocols and training programs. Jason tried to find another security job. He applied to over 20 different companies in the Atlanta area. Every application asked about prior terminations. Every background check revealed his firing for racial profiling. Every reference call to his former employer resulted in a confirmation of the termination and the reasons for it. No one would hire him. He expanded his search. He tried applying in other cities, thinking distance might help. It didn't. The security industry is surprisingly small, and word travels fast about guards terminated for discrimination. Jason's name was known. His story was known. And no company wanted to take the risk of hiring someone with his history. He tried to get hired using different names or leaving jobs off his application. But employment gaps raised questions, and background checks revealed his real work history. Some companies confronted him about the discrepancies. Others just silently rejected his application. Jason spent 6 months unemployed. He burned through his savings. He couldn't make rent on his apartment and had to move in with his parents. He was 29 years old, living in his childhood bedroom, with no career prospects and a growing sense of anger about his situation. In his mind, he'd been treated unfairly. He'd made a mistake, sure, but did that mistake deserve to cost him his entire career? Couldn't he get a second chance? But the companies making hiring decisions saw it differently. They saw someone who'd shown a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Someone who'd been warned by previous employers about similar issues and hadn't changed. Someone who'd used his authority to target vulnerable people. And most importantly, someone who, even after being fired, didn't seem to fully understand why his actions were wrong. Jason eventually left Atlanta. He moved to South Carolina, where his sister lived. She helped him get a job at a warehouse where her husband worked. The job was loading and unloading trucks. No authority, no uniform, no gun, just manual labor for $16 an hour with no benefits. It was a far cry from the security work he'd been doing. The work was physically demanding. The hours were long, the pay was barely enough to live on, and there was no career path, no opportunity for advancement, no sense that he was building toward anything. Last anyone heard, Jason was still there, loading trucks, making just enough to pay for his share of rent in a house he shared with 3 other people. No car. He'd had to sell it when he couldn't make the payments. No prospects. Just the daily grind of physical labor and the growing realization that his actions in that courthouse hallway had consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. Some people might say that's too harsh, that everyone deserves a second chance, that one series of mistakes shouldn't define a person's entire life. But Judge Williams, in an interview months later, put it in perspective. Jason wasn't fired for one mistake. He was fired for a pattern of behavior that he'd shown across multiple jobs. He'd been warned before. He'd been terminated before. He'd had chances to learn and change, and he didn't. At some point, Consequences have to match actions. And in a position where you have authority over others, where you can affect their safety and their dignity, the standards have to be high. If you can't meet those standards, if you use that authority to discriminate, then you shouldn't have that authority. It's that simple. Judge Williams continued her work on the bench. She was known as a fair judge, tough but reasonable. She didn't hold the incident with Jason against every security officer she encountered, but she also didn't forget it. She became an advocate for implicit bias training in the legal profession. She spoke at law schools about examining your own assumptions. She mentored young lawyers of color, helping them navigate systems that still sometimes treated them as if they didn't belong. Every morning when she walked through that secured hallway to her chambers, she remembered the moment when a security officer looked at her and saw only his assumptions, not her credentials, not her accomplishments, not her authority, just his biases. Jason Miller made an assumption that November morning he saw a black woman in a hallway and decided she couldn't be a judge. That assumption cost him his career and revealed a pattern that had been affecting multiple people for months. The security footage from that 90-second encounter has been viewed over 3 million times. It's used in diversity training programs across the country. It's shown in security courses as an example of what not to do. It's discussed in law school classes about professional respect. One moment, one assumption, one refusal to believe someone when they told you who they were, and consequences that rippled out far beyond one security guard and one judge. If this story changed how you think about snap judgments and assumptions, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories about accountability and justice. Drop a comment telling me about a time someone made wrong assumptions about you, and remember, credentials don't determine worth, but respect should be universal. Thanks for watching all the way through. See you in the next one.